The dog lunged first. Before any alarm, before any shouted order, a 60-pound Belgian Malinois hit the end of its leash and showed every tooth it had. And every single person in Trauma Bay stumbled backward against the walls. Every person except her. Margaret Holloway stood 5'4" in worn nursing clogs, holding a saline bag, and she did not move. While a decorated trauma surgeon pressed himself against a supply cabinet and a charge nurse knocked over an IV pole scrambling away, Margaret set the bag down slowly on the counter. The dog's growl was low and constant, vibrating through the floor. She spoke 2 words. Quiet. Flat. Military precise. The dog sat down like someone had cut its strings. Nobody in that room knew her real name yet. If you want to know who she really was, stay with me until the end. Hit like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift started at 6:15 in the morning, which meant Margaret Holloway had already been awake for 2 hours. That was the thing people at Harlow General Medical Center never understood about her. She arrived early, not because she was eager, but because the commute from her apartment on the east side of Delwood required 2 buses and a 12-minute walk, and the second bus ran late 40% of the time. She had calculated this during her first week on the job and adjusted accordingly. She was methodical that way. Had been for as long as she could remember, which wasn't always as far back as other people's memories went. She changed into scrubs in the locker room, tied her hair back, and poured coffee from the break room pot that someone had burned sometime after midnight, and nobody had bothered to replace. She drank it anyway. She was checking the morning assignment board when Delia Voss, the day charge nurse, appeared beside her with a clipboard and an expression that said she was about to apologize for something. "They moved you to trauma overflow again," Delia said. Margaret didn't look up from the board. "That's the 3rd time this week. Dr. Carver requested it." "Dr. Carver requested it? Or Dr. Carver's PA told you Dr. Carver requested it?" Delia had the decency to hesitate. "Does it matter?" It did, actually, because Dr. Marcus Carver, chief of trauma surgery at Harlow General, architect of 3 published research papers and 1 very large ego, had made it something of a personal project to keep Margaret Holloway out of his trauma bays. Not through any formal complaint. Nothing that could be documented or challenged. Just a steady bureaucratic pressure, the kind that comes from someone who has enough institutional weight to rearrange the world around a person without ever having to say why. Margaret had been at Harlow General for 14 months. In that time, she had been reassigned 11 times, denied the senior floor rotation twice, and had 2 of her patient assessments overridden without explanation, both times by Carver, both times in front of other staff. She kept a record, not out of bitterness exactly, more out of habit. "It matters," Margaret said, and wrote her name in the overflow column. Trauma Overflow at Harlow General was a half-renovated annex connected to the main emergency wing by a corridor that smelled like fresh drywall and old linoleum. It was understaffed, underfunded, and, on most mornings, genuinely forgotten by the senior physicians, which meant that the nurses working it were largely on their own. Margaret had decided early on that this was not the disadvantage everyone seemed to think it was. She arrived to find 2 nurses from the night shift desperate to leave, a post-op patient in Bay 4 whose drainage bag hadn't been checked in 3 hours, and a man in Bay 1 who had been triaged as a sprained wrist but whose skin color and breathing pattern told her something had been missed. She dealt with the drainage bag first, quick, no drama, and then pulled the curtain on Bay 1. The man's name was Harold Finch, 62, construction foreman. He told her the wrist story with the particular confidence of someone who had been to the ER before and learned that decisive self-diagnosis gets you seen faster. Margaret listened to the whole thing, nodded, and then asked him to describe the pressure in his chest. He blinked. "I didn't say anything about, 'You've been rubbing your sternum with your left thumb since I walked in,' she said, 'and you're breathing through your mouth even though your nose appears clear. How long?' He was quiet for a moment, then, 'Couple hours. I thought it was from lifting.' 'When did you lift last?' 'Yesterday.' She was already reaching for the call button, not running, not raising her voice, just moving with that particular efficiency that looked calm from the outside and was something else entirely on the inside. The attending cardiologist, who responded 12 minutes later, a compact, irritated woman named Dr. Sandra Osei, who had been in the middle of morning rounds, looked at the preliminary EKG. Margaret had already run and went still. You caught this from a triage for a sprained wrist? He presented with a sprained wrist, Margaret said. He had a NSTEMI. Osei looked at her for a moment. Name? Holloway. Trauma overflow. Why are you in overflow? Margaret said nothing. That answer was complicated, and this wasn't the moment. She was eating a granola bar in the supply corridor at 9:40 when she heard Carver's voice around the corner, the particular carrying tone he used when he wanted to be overheard. He was talking to one of his residents, a young man named Priya, who was actually named Priyesh, and had stopped correcting people about it. But doesn't matter how sharp they think they are. Nurses follow a protocol. They don't diagnose, they don't redirect, they execute the care plan. The moment you let them start improvising, you get chaos. I've seen it. Margaret finished the granola bar, folded the wrapper into a neat square. The Finch patient, Priyesh said quietly. That was her, right? Overflow nurse caught the... She got lucky, Carver said, and she overstepped. I'll be having a conversation with administration about clinical boundaries. Margaret put the folded wrapper in her pocket and walked back to her bay. She wasn't angry. She had stopped letting herself get angry at Marcus Carver around month 3, when she realized that anger was exactly what he expected and exactly what he would use. She had learned, a long time ago, in a context Carver couldn't imagine, that the most dangerous thing you could do to someone who underestimated you was nothing. Just keep working, keep being right. The morning continued. At 11:20, the hospital's main trauma line lit up. Margaret heard it from overflow, the specific burst of radio traffic that preceded a serious incoming, the spike in voices from the main bay, the sound of gurneys being repositioned. She didn't know what was coming in yet. She was in the middle of discharging a teenager with a laceration on his chin and making sure the aftercare instructions were clear enough that his mother, who kept asking if he'd need plastic surgery, could understand them without panic. No scar, the mother asked for the 3rd time. Clean closure, proper care, minimal scarring, Margaret said. But he needs to keep it out of direct sun for 6 weeks. 6 weeks? It's almost summer. I know, 6 weeks. She smiled at the boy who looked mortified. You'll live. She was signing off on the discharge when Delia appeared in the doorway with an expression Margaret hadn't seen on her before. They need you in Trauma 1. Carver's team is there. They're asking for you specifically. Margaret stopped. Who is? Delia pressed her lips together like she was deciding how much to say. Just come. Trauma Bay 1 was controlled chaos when Margaret pushed through the doors, and then it was a different kind of chaos entirely, because there was a dog in the middle of it. Not a small dog. A Belgian Malinois, full working weight, wearing a military-grade vest with a service patch she recognized instantly, even from across the room. The dog was positioned between the trauma team and the patient on the table, and it was not barking. It was doing something worse than barking. It was perfectly still, weight forward, showing teeth, making a sound low in its chest that meant it had assessed every person in this room and found them all to be threats. The patient was a young woman, late 20s, unconscious. Trauma to the head and abdomen, blood pressure monitor screaming. The paramedic report was still being read aloud by a tech near the door. Vehicle collision, possible internal hemorrhage, unknown time of unconsciousness. But nobody could get to her because the dog wouldn't let them. Carver was standing against the far wall. He was not a small man, and he was not normally someone who looked uncertain, but right now his arms were crossed, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were fixed on the dog with the expression of a man running calculations and not liking the results. Someone get animal control, he said. Animal control's 40 minutes out, the charge tech said. Then get the handler. Handler isn't here. Dog was in the vehicle. She came in alone. Margaret had stopped just inside the doors. She was looking at the dog. The dog, and this was important, was looking back at her. Not with threat, with something else. Recognition was the word that arrived in her mind, and she pushed it aside because this wasn't the moment. Holloway! Carver's voice was flat and hard. Why is she here? I asked her, Delia said from somewhere behind Margaret. This is an overflow. That patient needs intervention in the next 4 minutes or you're going to lose her. Margaret said. She wasn't looking at Carver. She was still looking at the dog. Her systolic is dropping. She's bleeding somewhere in the abdomen. You need to move. I'm aware of the clinical picture, Carver said. What I need is for someone to control this animal so my team can work. I can do that. He stopped, started again. You're overflow nursing staff. You're not a dog handler. No, Margaret agreed. I'm not. She walked toward the dog. The room went very still. Someone said her name. She thought it was Delia, but she kept moving, slow and deliberate, hands visible, posture low, and she was aware of every person in that room holding their breath. And she was aware of the dog reading her with every step, and she was aware of something older than the last 14 months moving through her body, like a current someone had switched back on. She stopped 3 feet from the dog, looked at it. The growl was still there, that continuous vibration. She spoke 2 words, low, flat, a specific cadence, a specific register that was not English and was not a command for a civilian animal. The dog sat. Complete stop. Weight back, posture relaxed, eyes still on her but soft now. Nobody in the room made a sound. Margaret straightened up. Someone get a leash point on the left wall mount. He'll stay if he's secured and can still see her. She turned to the room. You need to move. Now. The next 22 minutes were brutal in the way that real trauma always is. Not cinematic, not clean, full of the ugly sounds of a body being kept alive by force. Margaret worked the IV line while Carver's team opened imaging, and she was the one who noted the specific pattern of bruising along the patient's left flank that indicated splenic involvement before the ultrasound confirmed it. She said it quietly, without performance. Carver heard her. She watched him hear her and make the choice not to acknowledge it. She made a note. The young woman, no ID yet, no name, was stabilized and moved towards surgical prep. The dog was secured at the wall mount, watching. Margaret had checked the vest patch twice during the chaos, and both times felt something cold move through her chest. She knew that unit insignia. She knew it the way you know a scar on your own hand. She was checking medication logs when the main trauma bay doors opened again. 3 men walked in. That was the only way to describe it. They walked in, and the room shifted. Not military uniforms, but military bearing, the kind that doesn't leave a person even in civilian clothes. And they were scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent years walking into situations and immediately identifying what mattered. The one in front was older, late 50s, a face like compressed granite. He swept the room once, and his eyes landed on the dog, and something passed across his expression, relief, and then something harder. Then he saw Margaret. He stopped moving. The 2 men behind him stopped too. The older man's eyes moved over her face slowly, the way you look at something you haven't seen in a long time and are recalibrating. His jaw tightened. He said very quietly, "What do they call you here?" Margaret met his eyes, held them. "Holloway," she said. "Margaret Holloway." The man nodded once, slowly. "Is she alive?" "She's in pre-op. Splenic laceration, probable. Surgery in the next 20 minutes. Margaret paused. "She's going to make it." Something moved through him. Not softness, exactly. Relief is a hard thing on a hard face. He turned to the man on his left and said something low and clipped that Margaret didn't catch. Behind her, she heard Marcus Carver say, "Who are you people? This is a restricted clinical area." The older man turned his head. He looked at Carver with the particular absence of expression that is more unsettling than any anger. "Admiral James Weston," he said, "you have my daughter on your table." Margaret had worked enough trauma to know when a room's weight shifted permanently. It happened sometimes. A revelation, an arrival, a piece of information that quietly rearranged every relationship in the space. She had seen it happen on the other side of the world in circumstances she did not think about in the women's locker room of Harlow General Medical Center. She recognized it the same way she had recognized the dog's unit patch. Carver recovered fast. He had the practiced facility of a man who'd built a career on controlling rooms. "Admiral, I'm Dr. Marcus Carver, Trauma Chief. Your daughter is receiving the best possible care. She nearly died because your team couldn't reach her," Weston said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of observed fact, delivered without heat, which made it worse. Who controlled the dog? A beat of silence. Then one of the nurses, a young man named Tommy, who had only been on the floor 3 months and didn't yet know how these political calculations worked, pointed at Margaret. Weston looked at her again. Differently this time. "We should talk," he said. "I have patience," Margaret said. "After your shift." "I have patience now, Admiral." She kept her voice level. "Your daughter needs you in the surgical waiting area, not here." Weston looked at her for a long moment, something like assessment. Then he nodded, and he and his 2 men moved out of the bay. Carver turned to her the moment the doors closed. "Holloway." His voice was very controlled. "A word. I need to finish now. Done." His office was on the 3rd floor, corner position, window overlooking the ambulance bay. The kind of office that announces itself. He closed the door behind them and turned, and Margaret noticed for the first time that he was slightly flushed. Not enough that most people would catch it. She caught it. "What you did in that bay," he said. "Stabilized the IV line and identified probable splenic. I'm not talking about the IV line." He moved behind his desk. Didn't sit. Standing behind the desk was a power posture, she knew. And she also knew that he knew it, which meant this conversation had already been choreographed in his head before it started. "I'm talking about the dog. I'm talking about the way you—" He stopped, started differently. "Where did you learn that command?" "What command?" "Don't do that." She looked at him steadily. "You spoke to that animal in, I don't know what language that was, but it wasn't a standard command, and the dog responded like it had been trained to respond to you specifically. Dogs are unpredictable." "That dog was not unpredictable." His voice dropped. "That dog recognized you. I was watching." Margaret said nothing. Carver put his hands flat on the desk. "I don't know what your background is." "It's in my employment file." "Your employment file says you did 3 years of nursing school, 1 year of residency at Eastbrook Community, and then you came here." He paused. "That file is not telling me everything." "Files rarely do," she said. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't in 14 months of treating her like movable furniture, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. She wasn't sure what it was. Curiosity, recalculation, maybe something else. "Admiral Weston is a significant figure," he said. "High-level Special Operations Command, congressional relationships, the kind of man whose goodwill matters to a hospital like this." "I'm aware. If he's interested in the nurse who handled his daughter's care was handled by your surgical team," Margaret said. "I identified the bleed and secured the dog, that's all." "That's not all," he said, "and we both know it." She looked at him for 3 more seconds, then, "I should get back. I'm not done. My patients are." She turned for the door. "Holloway." His voice came out harder. She stopped but didn't turn. "This isn't your territory. Whatever history you have with Weston or his people or that animal, you're an overflow nurse at a regional trauma center. Don't forget that." She had her hand on the door. She thought about 14 months of supply corridors and granola bar lunches, and overridden assessments, and a man who had never once looked at her like she was capable of something he hadn't already decided. She pulled the door open. "I know exactly where I am," she said. "Do you?" The rest of the shift passed in the particular way that hard shifts do, not fast, not slow, but with the relentless forward movement of one thing after another. A diabetic patient in Bay 3 who needed a careful conversation about compliance. A child with a broken collarbone whose mother was trying very hard not to cry in front of him. 2 post-op discharges, one more complex than the other. She worked. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, which was the thing that made the last 14 months sustainable. Not comfortable, not fair, but sustainable. There was something clarifying about being underestimated. It kept your edges sharp. At 3:40, Delia found her in the medication room. "Weston's still here," she said quietly. "His daughter's out of surgery. She's stable." She paused. "He asked about you again." "He can ask all he wants," Margaret said. Marg. Delia was one of 3 people at Harlow General who shortened her name. She did it with a particular gentleness that Margaret had not asked for and had never found a way to refuse. "Those men he came in with, the younger ones." "I saw them." One of them asked Tommy if you'd ever mentioned military service. Margaret looked up from the medication log. Tommy said no, Delia continued, but he also said one of them, the taller one, the one on Weston's left. He said that man looked at you in the bay like... She searched for the word. Like he already knew you. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about the unit patch on the dog's vest. She thought about a protocol she had memorized so thoroughly it had become instinct. She thought about the way those two words had come out of her, not recalled, not searched for, just present, still there, after everything. I need to finish these logs, she said. Delia nodded slowly, didn't push. That was one of the things Margaret had found, in 14 months at Harlow General, that she'd learned to rely on without meaning to. She was changed back into her street clothes at 4:50, bag on her shoulder, when she turned the corner of the staff exit corridor and nearly walked into the taller of Weston's two men. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not blocking the corridor, not aggressive, but specifically waiting. He was mid-30s, dark hair going silver at the temples, the kind of stillness that isn't relaxed but is very controlled. He looked at her with eyes that had done the same kind of calculating she did and arrived at a different question. "Lieutenant Hart," he said. The corridor was empty. The fluorescents buzzed. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Margaret kept her expression neutral. It was something she had trained for and also something she had needed in circumstances beyond any training. "That's not my name." "No," he agreed. "Not anymore." He pushed off the wall. "I'm Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves. You might not remember me. You pulled two men out of a burning wreck in a situation that officially did not happen 7 years ago. I was the third man. I was the one who made it out on his own." She looked at him, his face, the particular way he held his jaw. She did remember him. "Why are you here?" she said. "Admiral Weston wants to thank you." I told him, "Not for today," Reeves said. "For then." He paused. "He knew one of the two men you extracted, knew him well." A beat. "We've been looking for you for a while, Lieutenant, or whoever you are now." Margaret adjusted the strap of her bag, looked past him toward the exit, thought about what looking for her meant, and whether Weston's people looking for her was a different kind of problem than not being found. "Tell the Admiral I'm glad his daughter is stable," she said, "and that I appreciate his concern." She moved past Reeves toward the door. He didn't stop her. "There's something else," he said behind her. She slowed. "The collision that put her here." A pause, waited. "We don't think it was an accident." The door was 6 feet away. The evening air was visible through the glass panel, the parking lot, the ordinary world of end of shift and buses to catch. She stopped, turned back. "Tell me," she said. Reeves didn't move when she turned back. He had the patience of someone who had learned that the wrong word at the wrong moment could end a conversation permanently, and he chose his next ones carefully. The vehicle she was in, a 2022 Tahoe registered to the base motor pool, had brake line damage, not failure. Damage. He let that sit for a second. The kind that takes approximately 40 miles to show up. She was coming from the base, 41 miles out. Margaret stood in the corridor with her bag on her shoulder and ran the math on that the way she used to run mission parameters, not emotionally, just as a sequence of facts that needed to resolve into a shape. Who knows? Right now? The Admiral, me, one federal investigator named Calloway, who is currently very interested in security footage from the base motor pool. He paused. And you? Why me? He looked at her. Not the way people usually looked at her at Harlow General, assessing her usefulness, measuring her place in the hierarchy. He looked at her the way you look at someone you once watched do something you've never fully explained to yourself. Because you're the one who kept her alive long enough for it to matter. She didn't say anything to that. The compliment, if that's what it was, sat between them unacknowledged. "What does Weston want from me specifically?" she said. "To meet. Tonight if possible." He reached into his jacket, produced a card, plain, no insignia, just a phone number. "He's not asking for anything operational. He just..." Reeves stopped, searched for something honest. "He wants to look at the person who pulled his daughter back from that table, and I think he wants to say something he should have said 7 years ago. Margaret looked at the card, did not take it immediately. The investigator, she said. Calloway? Is she good? Best I've worked with. Is she looking at the hospital? A beat, fractional, but she caught it. She's looking at everything, Reeves said. Margaret took the card. She almost didn't go. She sat on the first bus with the card in her jacket pocket and her bag on her knees and watched Delwood scroll past the window, the repair shops and the laundromats and the taco place with the permanently broken sign, and she thought about the very specific piece she had assembled for herself in the last 4 years. It was not a comfortable piece. It was not the kind of peace that came from happiness. It was the kind that comes from having burned everything down and built something from the ash that was smaller but stable. And the thing about that kind of peace is that it is very fragile and you know it and you protect it accordingly. She had a night routine. She had an apartment with 3 plants she kept alive with more effort than she let herself acknowledge. She had 2 neighbors whose names she knew and 2 whose names she didn't. She had Harlow General, where she was disliked and underestimated and occasionally allowed to save someone's life when the right conditions aligned. She had very specifically not had Admiral James Weston or anyone from that world. The bus lurched to a stop. She looked at the card. She got off 2 stops early and called the number. They met at a hotel near the waterfront, a business-class place with a lobby that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner. Not lavish. Functional. The kind of place a military man chooses because it has good sightlines and controllable exits, not because he cares about thread count. Weston was in a corner seat near the window with a glass of water in front of him and the 2-floor view of the lobby behind him. He stood when she came in. Not a performed courtesy, something automatic, the kind of respect that's been built into a person over decades until it runs below thought. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had only ever seen him from a distance, through reports and briefings, the way you see command-level figures when you're far enough down the chain that they exist as concepts more than people. Ms. Holloway, he said. Admiral. He gestured to the seat across from him. She sat, didn't take off her jacket. He studied her face for a moment in a way that wasn't rude and wasn't comfortable, like he was reconciling 2 images, the one he'd carried for 7 years and the one in front of him now. Reeves told me what he said to you, Weston started. Good. Saves time. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Your file, the one we had before. It listed you as KIA after the Navarre extraction. I know what it listed. I never questioned it. He picked up the glass of water, set it down without drinking. I should have. It was a reasonable conclusion given the circumstances, she said. You were 29 years old and one of the best extraction pilots we had. His voice stayed level. It wasn't reasonable. It was convenient. She looked out the window. Below, someone was walking a small dog along the waterfront, and the dog kept stopping to investigate things the person couldn't see. What happened to you? He said. After. She had considered, on the bus, how much of this conversation she was willing to have. She had decided on a number that was small, but not 0. I was injured in the crash. Not the way the report said. I wasn't in the wreck they found. I went into the water. I made it to the eastern bank. She paused. By the time I was functional enough to surface, the op was buried, and my name was on a wall, and I had a choice about who to be. You could have come back. I didn't want to come back, she said plainly. He absorbed that, didn't push back on it, which she respected. The 2 men you extracted from Navarre, he said, Sergeant Pyle and Corporal Adkins. Pyle died of his injuries 6 months later. Adkins is still with us. He's got 2 kids. He looked at her directly. He named his daughter Evie, said it was after a soldier who got him out. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. It was the kind of information that had weight, and you just had to hold it. My daughter, Weston said. Nadia. She doesn't know any of this. She thinks today was a car accident. Let her think that for now, Margaret said, until you know more. Calloway briefed me an hour ago. The brake line damage was deliberate, professionally done. This wasn't opportunistic. It required access, timing, and knowledge of Nadia's schedule. He paused. Someone knew she'd be on that road. Access to the motor pool means access to the base. Or access to someone with access. He leaned back slightly. Calloway is running it. She's good, like Reeves said. But she's one investigator, and this is moving fast. Whoever did this, they'll know it didn't work. They'll adjust. Margaret looked at him. What are you asking me, Admiral? I'm asking you to be close to Nadia during her recovery. Here, at this hospital. She felt something shift in her chest. Not quite resistance, but its cousin. I'm overflow nursing staff. I can change that. I don't want you to change that. He looked genuinely surprised. It was the first crack she'd seen in his composure. If you pull rank to get me reassigned to Nadia's care, you flag me, she said. Whoever is running this, they'll want to know why an admiral is suddenly interested in a specific nurse. You make me a target, and you make me less useful at the same time. She held his eyes. Let me work my way to her, naturally. He was quiet for a moment, then, you haven't changed. I've changed plenty, she said. I just kept the parts that worked. She was back in her apartment by 9:15. She made tea she didn't drink and stood at the window looking at the street below and processed the evening, the way she processed hard things, methodically, in segments, without letting them blur together into something she couldn't manage. Fact. Nadia Weston had been targeted. Fact. The targeting required insider knowledge and access. Fact. Calloway was investigating and had not yet ruled out the hospital as part of the network. That last part was the one Margaret kept returning to. Reeves had caught himself before saying it directly, but the hesitation had been enough. Calloway was looking at the hospital, which meant someone at Harlow General was either involved or had been compromised, and which meant that every shift Margaret had spent in that building had been spent in proximity to something she hadn't known was there. She thought about Marcus Carver. The way he'd asked about the command she'd used with the dog. The specific quality of his attention, not just irritated, not just territorial, but something that had sharpened in a way she hadn't been able to name in the moment. She named it now, standing at the window. He'd been afraid of what she knew. The morning shift started at 6:15. Margaret arrived at 6:05. She changed in the locker room, poured coffee from a pot that was, for once, freshly made. Someone on night shift must have had a good conscience, and checked the assignment board. She'd been moved back to overflow. She wrote her name down without expression and went to work. The trauma wing at Harlow General operated on 3 floors, with surgical recovery on 4. She knew because she had pulled Nadia Weston's post-op location from the system the night before, discreetly, buried in a routine medication cross-check that would not flag as unusual, that Nadia was in room 412. Private room. 2 of Weston's men outside the door, in civilian clothes, doing a bad job of looking like family members because military men have a particular way of standing in doorways that is not like any family member she'd ever met. She was in overflow, and 412 was a floor up and 3 wings over. She had no reason to be there. She went about the morning. At 8:40, she was in the middle of wound care for a post-op patient when her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was federal. She finished the wound dressing before she stepped out to check it. Text message, 3 lines. Harlow General Administration accessed. Records query on patient NW 0300 this morning. IP traced to internal terminal. Terminal location, 3rd floor physician offices. No signature. But it had to be Calloway. Margaret stood in the supply corridor with her phone in her hand and looked at the fluorescent light above her and thought about the 3rd floor physician offices, the floor with the department heads, the senior staff, the floor with Marcus Carver's corner office overlooking the ambulance bay, a records query on Nadia Weston at 3 in the morning. Not a clinical query, an administrative one. Someone pulling her insurance details, her listed next of kin, her home address. Margaret texted back a single word. Confirmed. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to her patient. By 11, she had made a decision. It wasn't the kind of decision you deliberate at length. It was the kind that assembles itself from available data until it becomes the only logical conclusion, and then you act on it before the circumstances change. She had made that kind of decision before. She was good at it. She had been good at it when she was Lieutenant Evelyn Hart, and she was still good at it as Margaret Holloway, overflow nurse. She took her lunch break at 11:20 and walked to the third floor. The physician offices were accessible by key card for clinical staff. Margaret had a clinical staff card, basic access, not administrator level, and the third floor corridor was common territory for any nurse carrying labs or patient documentation. She had labs. She had pulled a set of results for a patient she genuinely needed to deliver, because if she was going to walk through Carver's corridor, she was going to do it holding something real. She moved through the third floor at a measured pace. Two residents going the other direction, neither looked at her. A med student staring at his phone. The usual morning traffic of people too busy to register the woman in scrubs, walking steadily toward the far end. Carver's office door was closed. She paused outside a supply alcove 2 doors down, pretending to check her clipboard, and listened. Voices. Carver's, low and controlled. And another, male, unfamiliar, something in the register that she placed immediately as not clinical. The way it clipped its consonants, the cadence of someone giving information rather than receiving it. She caught 3 words through the door before a cart rattled past and covered the rest. Moved to tomorrow. She kept walking, delivered the labs, went back to overflow. Moved to tomorrow. Moved what to tomorrow? The extraction attempt? A second attempt on Nadia? A meeting? A transfer? An exit? She pulled out her phone and texted Calloway's number again. Office 1123H. Second voice, unidentified male, not clinical staff. Possible. This time the response came in 40 seconds. Stay out of it. I mean it. Margaret read that twice, put the phone away. She understood the instruction. She had given versions of it herself once, to people who wanted to help from inside a situation they didn't have the full picture of. Stay out of it was not a dismissal. Stay out of it was a chess move. It meant Calloway had something positioned and didn't want her moving pieces without coordinates. She went back to work. At 1:45, she was leaving overflow for the restroom when she turned the corner and found Marcus Carver waiting in the corridor. Not in his office, not on his floor. Down here, in the overflow annex. In the corridor outside the bays, which was as far from his natural territory as a department chief could get without leaving the building. He looked wrong. That was the only word for it. Marcus Carver always looked like he owned whatever room he was in, and right now he looked like a man who had been given information that had made the room feel smaller. His tie was slightly off-center. There was a coffee stain on the left cuff of his shirt that she would have bet money wasn't there at rounds this morning. Holloway, he said. She stopped. Dr. Carver, I need to talk to you. You could make an appointment, she said, given that you're not rostered for overflow today. Something crossed his face. Not anger. The other thing, the thing she'd seen yesterday and now had a better name for. This isn't about rounds. Then what is it about? He glanced down the corridor, both directions. The specific neck movement of someone who did not want to be overheard having this particular conversation. I know who you are, he said quietly. Margaret felt her pulse do nothing. She had trained it for exactly this. You know I'm a nurse. You've said so repeatedly. I know what you were. He stepped closer, dropped his voice further. And I know someone else knows too. Someone who is very interested in what a retired... He stopped, chose the word carefully. Specialist is doing working overflow at a regional trauma center. She looked at him. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere 2 bays over, a monitor alarm went and then stopped. Dr. Carver, she said slowly, who have you been talking to? His jaw moved. He was working up to something. She could see it assembling in him, the thing he'd come down here to say, the offer or the warning or the confession, and she was calculating whether she wanted to hear it in this corridor or whether this needed Calloway's ears. And in the half second before he opened his mouth, his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He looked at the screen. His face went white. Not pale. White. The color of a person who has received information they had specifically arranged not to receive. He looked up at her. And for the first time in 14 months, Marcus Carver looked at Margaret Holloway like she was something he was afraid of. I need to, he started. He was already moving, not toward the exit, toward the elevator, fast. She watched him go, counted to 3. Then she pulled out her phone and called Reeves. He picked up on the second ring. Where's Calloway right now? She said. A pause. Why? Because Carver just ran, she said. And wherever he's running to, Nadia's in the same building. Reeves went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. In a person less trained, that would have been processing time. In Reeves, it was the sound of a tactical decision being made. Floor 4 is locked down. My guys are on the door. Locked down means nothing if Carver has clinical access to that floor, Margaret said. She was already moving, not running, walking fast down the overflow corridor toward the main wing connector. Running draws attention. Running makes people ask questions you don't have time to answer. He's trauma chief. His key card clears every clinical floor in this building. What did he say to you? He said he knows who I am. Then he got a message, and he left. She pushed through the connector door. Main wing now, busier, the background noise of a functioning hospital rising around her. The message scared him. That's the part that worries me. Why? Because men like Carver don't scare easy. And when they do, they don't run toward the problem. They run toward whatever they think can protect them. She hit the stairwell door, took the stairs because the elevator was slower and she needed to think. Who is Nadia's surgeon? Dr. Park. Why? Is Park part of this? A beat. Calloway says no. Is Calloway sure? Longer pause. She says 80%. That's not sure. She was on the 3rd floor landing, one more flight. Get Calloway to 4 right now, and tell your guys on the door, nobody with a white coat goes in without Calloway present. Not Park, not anyone. That's going to cause a scene. Good, Margaret said, and came through the 4th floor door. But the hallway of the surgical recovery wing looked the way hospital hallways always look. Fluorescent and quiet, and slightly too cold, with the particular smell of antiseptic layered over something more organic underneath. Margaret had worked enough of them to stop noticing the smell, but she noticed everything else. The first thing she noticed was that one of Weston's 2 men was not at the door. The second thing she noticed was that the remaining man, stocky, crew-cut, the one who'd been on Weston's right yesterday, was standing with his arms crossed and his back against the wall next to 412, and his eyes moved to her as she came down the hall with the very specific speed and stillness of someone who has been watching the corridor long enough that movement registers immediately. His name was Garza. She'd gotten that from Reeves last night. Where's your partner? She said when she was close enough. Cafeteria run. His jaw was tight. 15 minutes. Call him back now. Garza looked at her. Not resistance, assessment. He was reading whether this was worth acting on. She met his eyes and didn't blink. He pulled out his phone and typed. Has anyone been in? She said. Dr. Park at 9. Nurse on the hour at 11. No one since. Carver's in the building. He's moving. That landed. Garza straightened away from the wall by an inch, which on a man like him was the equivalent of going on full alert. You sure? I watched him get on the elevator 3 minutes ago. She moved to stand beside him. When his partner gets back, one of you goes inside. Stay with Nadia directly. The door being locked doesn't mean enough right now. She's sedated. Post-op. I know. Do it anyway. He texted again. Margaret looked down the corridor in both directions. The hallway was quiet. 2 nurses at the station 20 meters down, a family member coming out of a room further along, nothing that broke the pattern, which meant if Carver was coming to this floor, he hadn't arrived yet, or he'd already found a reason not to. Her phone buzzed. Calloway. 3rd floor terminal accessed again 1147. Different query. Pulled surgical recovery room assignments. Margaret's stomach went cold. He wasn't running away. He was looking up exactly where Nadia was. She showed Garza the screen. He read it once and opened the door to 412. Topok. The room was dim. Blinds half drawn, the particular institutional half-light of recovery rooms where the goal is rest without complete darkness. Nadia Weston was on the bed with a drain tube and an IV line, and the specific flattened stillness of heavy sedation, her breathing slow and audible. She was younger looking than Margaret had expected, or maybe injury made everyone look younger. It stripped away the posture and the expression and left just the person underneath. Garza moved to the chair beside the bed. Margaret checked the IV line, habit, reflexive, the same way she checked every patient in every room she walked into, and looked at the monitors. Stable. Heart rate 61. Blood pressure holding. Oxygen 97%. Park had done clean work. She positioned herself just inside the door and looked out through the narrow window panel at the corridor. 12 minutes passed. At minute 4, Garza's partner, Reynolds, that was the name, came back down the hall at a pace that was not quite a run, but close enough that the nurse at the station looked up. He slipped into the room, and the two men exchanged 3 words that Margaret didn't catch. At minute 9, she saw Marcus Carver come around the far corner of the hallway. He was in his white coat, chart in hand. Completely normal presentation for a department chief doing rounds on any floor of his hospital, except that Marcus Carver did not do surgical recovery rounds. He had not, to Margaret's knowledge, been on floor 4 in a clinical capacity since she'd been at Harlow General, and he was walking with a specific kind of deliberate normality that she recognized as performance. Normal people don't think about walking normally. People who are trying to look normal do. She stepped back from the door window so he wouldn't see her through the glass. Watched him come. He stopped at the nursing station. Spoke to the nurse there, young woman, new, Margaret didn't know her name yet. The nurse checked something on her computer, pointed down the hall, in the direction of 412. Margaret turned to Reynolds. He's confirming the room. Get Admiral Weston on the phone right now. Reynolds was already dialing. She turned back to the window. Carver had thanked the nurse and was coming down the hall. Slower now, not hesitant, measuring, the walk of a man checking his options before he commits to something. Her phone buzzed. Calloway. Where are you? Margaret typed back, 412. He's in the hallway. 3 seconds. Then, do not engage, I am 4 minutes out. 4 minutes was an eternity. She watched Carver get to within 6 doors of 412 and stop. He was looking at his chart, or performing looking at his chart. She saw his eyes come up from the paper, flick to the door of 412, and then, something she hadn't expected, flick to the door directly opposite. Room 411. Empty room. She'd passed it coming in, door open, unmade bed, no patient. He went into 411. That was the move she hadn't calculated. Not toward Nadia, adjacent to her, which meant either he was retreating to regroup or the wall. She had done enough time in enough facilities to know that surgical recovery rooms shared utility corridors, not full corridors, service access panels, medication transfer points, sometimes intercom lines. An empty room directly opposite a target room was not an approach. It was a listening post, or a relay point. Someone in 411 could pass information out through a service channel that bypassed the main floor, or pass something in. She moved out of 412 and into the hallway before she'd fully consciously decided to, because the alternative was waiting, and waiting was the wrong call when the clock was already running. She pushed open the door to 411. Carver turned from the window. He had his phone in his hand, and his expression cycled through 3 things in under a second: surprise, calculation, and then a kind of resignation that told her the calculation had come up short. Put the phone down, she said. This is a clinical space. Put the phone down, Dr. Carver. He looked at her. The phone stayed in his hand, but his thumb moved off the screen. She watched it move. You don't have authority to... Someone is 4 minutes away who does, she said. So whatever you are about to do, you're going to want to think about the difference between what happens in the next 3 minutes and what happens in the 4 minutes after that. Something in his face broke open. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies with tears and speeches. Just a small, tired fracture. The expression of a man who has been managing something very heavy for a very long time and has just reached the point where the weight exceeds what his body can hold. It wasn't supposed to be her, he said. Margaret felt everything in her go still. Weston was the target, Carver said. The words came out low and stripped of all the authority he normally carried. He sounded like himself, the actual person underneath the title and the office, who turned out to be frightened and in over his head, and apparently had been for some time. The network needed his access codes to complete a transfer. Nadia was leverage, not she was supposed to be leverage. They told me she wouldn't be harmed. They tampered with her brakes, Margaret said. I didn't know that. He met her eyes, and she read him the way she had learned to read people in high-pressure situations. Not for what they wanted her to believe, but for what they couldn't help showing. He was telling the truth about not knowing, which made him a fool, but not perhaps the specific kind of monster she'd been building in her head. They told me it would be a minor incident, a delay, enough to keep Weston occupied while you did what? He pressed his lips together. Carver. She stepped closer. Not threatening, direct. Nadia is alive because of the people in that room yesterday, and she is at risk right now because of what you started. So tell me what you were sent here to do. His phone buzzed in his hand. He looked at the screen, and his jaw went tight. They know she survived surgery, he said. They're adjusting. He looked up. Someone is coming to this floor. Not me. I'm supposed to be creating a distraction. Medical complication. Pull the staff from the recovery wing. Redirect. He stopped. I was supposed to flag a crisis in another room. To clear the hallway? Yes. Margaret turned and went back into the hallway at a pace that left no room for anything except what needed to happen in the next 90 seconds. She got to 412 and opened the door. Garza looked up. Reynolds was still on the phone with Weston. Nadia hadn't moved. Someone's coming to this floor with access and a plan to clear the hallway, she said. They needed Carver to create a medical diversion. He didn't, so they'll improvise. She looked at Garza. You need to get her moved. Not discharged, moved. Different room, different floor, right now, before they figure out Carver failed. We can't just move a post-op patient. You can if there's a clinical reason. There's a clinical reason. She went to the monitors, looked at the numbers. Nadia's blood pressure had been holding at 112/70. Good. Not perfect. She'd just had abdominal surgery 24 hours ago, but stable enough that a transfer wouldn't be the risk. I'll document a monitoring concern. That buys us cover for the move. If she crashes during a transfer, she won't. But she might if someone gets into this room. She looked at him steady. Which is the bigger risk? Reynolds lowered his phone. Admiral says move her. His authorization. Garza was already standing. The two men worked fast, the way trained people work. No wasted motion, no questions for the sake of questions. Reynolds went for a transport gurney from the corridor, and Margaret pulled up Nadia's chart on the room terminal and documented a notation that was clinically defensible and vague enough to justify a floor change without triggering a full emergency response. She was not falsifying a record. She was documenting a genuine concern, which was that the patient's current location was no longer safe, translated into medical language, abnormal pressure trend, monitoring adjustment required, temporary relocation to secondary recovery observation. It was the kind of note that would make a reviewing physician narrow their eyes and then shrug, because it was the kind of thing experienced nurses documented when they had an instinct they couldn't fully quantify but couldn't ignore. She had never, in 14 months at Harlow General, documented a note that wasn't accurate. She would not start now. Reynolds came back with the gurney. The three of them transferred Nadia with the careful deliberateness that post-op patients require, maintaining drain integrity, keeping the IV line from pulling, watching the monitor numbers. Nadia made a small sound during the transfer, the involuntary vocalization of sedation disturbed, and Margaret put a hand briefly on her shoulder and kept it there until the sound stopped. Room 308, Margaret said. It's surgical post-op, it's monitored, and it's not in the directory yet because it was just cleared from renovation this week. She had seen the maintenance notice on the board 3 days ago and filed it in the part of her mind that kept information without assigning it a purpose until a purpose arrived. Nobody querying the room system will find her there tonight. How do you know it's cleared for patients? Garza asked. I checked the linen inventory this morning. Fresh bed, working monitors, connected to the nursing station feed. It's ready. She looked at him. I check a lot of things. They moved Nadia to 308 in 4 minutes. Margaret walked ahead, checking the corridor at each intersection the way she'd once checked forward positions. Not dramatically, just a quick read of the space before committing to it. Twice she redirected them around a hallway where staff traffic was heavy. Once she stopped them for 20 seconds while a housekeeping cart went past. Nobody looked at them. A nurse and 2 visitors moving a post-op patient to a different room. It was the most normal thing in the world. Calloway arrived on floor 4 at the moment they were leaving it. Margaret texted her, 412 is empty. She's in 308. Carver is in 411. He's talking. She got back, "You moved a post-op patient." "Yes." A pause. Then, "Was she stable?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Fine. I'll deal with the paperwork. Stay with her." Room 308 smelled like fresh paint under the antiseptic. The monitors took 40 seconds to calibrate. Margaret hooked up the IV line, while Garza positioned the gurney alongside the bed, and Reynolds stood at the door. When Nadia was settled and the numbers were green and the room was quiet enough that the only sound was the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, Margaret let herself lean against the wall for a moment and breathe. Not relief. Not yet. Relief required the situation to be over, and the situation was not over. Carver was on floor 4 talking to Calloway, which was either the thing that unraveled the network or the thing that sent it underground before they could get to it. Someone with access had been approaching this floor with a plan that had now been disrupted, which meant that person was in the building, right now recalculating. And whoever they were, they had gotten access to this hospital, to a military motor pool, to Admiral Weston's daughter's schedule, and they had done all of it while looking clinical and authorized and completely unremarkable. She knew what that kind of invisible competence looked like. She'd had it once herself. Her phone rang. Reeves. "Calloway has Carver," he said. "He's cooperating, full cooperation." "Who is the contact inside the hospital?" "That's the problem." A pause. "Carver says he never met them directly. Everything was passed through a dead drop system. Documents left in a specific supply cabinet on the second floor, retrieved on a schedule. He has a description of one meeting, 3 months ago. A man. White coat, hospital ID, but Carver thinks it was a fake. The photo didn't match the name." "Security footage?" Calloway pulled it. "The cabinet location is in a blind spot. Whoever set this up knew the camera layout." Margaret pushed off the wall. Knew the camera layout. Not guessed. Knew. Which meant they had been in this building long enough to map it, or they had someone who had been. "Calloway's working the ID angle," Reeves continued, "but Carver doesn't have enough. And we still have an unidentified person in this building who knows Carver missed his assignment." "What was the distraction supposed to be?" she asked. "Carver was supposed to call a code on a patient in room 409. Elderly post-op, real patient, but Carver would have flagged a false deterioration. Staff responds. Floor clears of non-essential personnel. Someone walks into 412 with a maintenance uniform and access to the medication system." "Medication system," she repeated. "Not physical force." "Potassium chloride, in the IV line. Looks like a cardiac event in a post-op patient. Standard investigation would assume surgical complication." Reeves's voice was flat. The flatness of someone delivering information they find deeply ugly. "Clean, medical. Hard to prove." Margaret stood in room 308 with a stable patient and 2 armed men, and the cold understanding that the person who had planned this was methodical enough to make a murder look like a complication, and patient enough to have built the access network to do it. This was not improvised. This had been built over time, piece by piece, inside an institution people trusted with their lives. "The maintenance uniform," she said. "That's not improvised cover. Someone has that ready." "Yeah." "Which means they're still planning to use it, even now, even with Carver pulled." A pause. Calloway needs to look at every maintenance worker in this building right now," Margaret said. "Not the records. The actual people, in person, matched against their photos. Because whoever has that uniform, they may already be in position." She heard Reeves relay that on another line. A brief exchange, clipped and fast. Then he came back. "She's on it." "But Marg," the name surprised her coming from him. He'd used it without thinking, like it was a name he'd said before, which it was. 7 years ago, in a different context, different person. "There's one more thing." "Say it." "The network Carver's connected to. Calloway's been tracking it for 18 months. It's not just intelligence trafficking. The medical channel is one arm. They've been moving personnel documents, security clearances, identity packages, false credentials for people who need to exist inside institutions without being real. A legend factory," she said, "using medical records as the backbone. People die in hospitals. People get lost in the system. If you have someone on the inside who can alter records, create a patient history, attach a real social security number to a manufactured identity, you can make anyone real, she said. The full shape of it arrived, not just Carver, not just one hospital, not just Nadia, the size of it. How many institutions? At least 6 that they've identified. Harlow General is the most recent. Then whoever is in this building isn't just here for Nadia, she said slowly. They're here because this is an active node. Nadia's death would have been a bonus, a way to control Weston, but the primary operation is still running. Yes. She thought about this for 3 seconds, which was as long as she had. Then pulling Carver and moving Nadia isn't enough. If they know the node is compromised, they'll destroy the evidence and rebuild somewhere else. Calloway knows. Does she have enough to move on the supply cabinet before whoever it is cleans it? She sent someone 2 minutes ago. And the person with the maintenance uniform? Still looking. Margaret looked at Garza and Reynolds, both of them watching her, reading the room the way trained men do. Not the walls and the monitors, but her, the person who kept being right about things. I need a hospital directory, she said. Current maintenance staff, full roster. Garza produced his phone. I can pull the HR database if Weston authorizes. He'll authorize it. Call him. While Garza called, Margaret stood at Nadia's bedside and looked at the monitors and thought about camera blind spots and supply cabinets and a network that had been running for 18 months inside 6 institutions. And she thought about the kind of person who builds something like that. Patient, methodical, comfortable in a medical environment, someone who moved through a hospital like they belonged. Her phone buzzed. Not Calloway, not Reeves, the Harlow General internal system. A notification pushed to all clinical staff. All personnel. Code Gray, 3rd floor corridor. B. Security response in progress. Please avoid the area. Code Gray. Combative person. 3rd floor corridor B. Carver's office was on 3rd floor, corridor B. She looked at the notification for 1 second, then called Reeves back. He picked up and said before she could speak, I know. Someone triggered the code. It's not real. Security dispatch confirmed no call came from clinical staff. It was triggered from a public terminal near the main entrance. It'll pull staff away from floor 4, she said. Even with Nadia moved, they're not going for the room anymore. Then what? Carver, she said. Whoever's in this building, they know he's talking. They triggered the code to create movement, confusion, something to work inside. She was already moving toward the door. Where is Calloway right now? 3rd floor, with Carver, corridor B. The cold settled hard in the center of her chest. She walked into it, Margaret said. Marg, tell her, right now. She looked back at Garza. Stay with Nadia. Do not open that door for anyone except me, Reeves, or the Admiral. Where are you going? Garza said. She was already out the door. The stairwell was faster than the elevator, and she took the stairs at a controlled run. Not reckless, not panicked. The efficient movement of someone who has covered ground in worse conditions than a hospital staircase. 1 floor down, through the door, into the 3rd floor corridor. It was more crowded than it should have been. The Code Gray had pulled people, nurses turning, looking, a group of staff near the nurses' station buzzing with the specific energy of disrupted routine. It was good crowd cover. That was the point. She was scanning faces, moving through, looking for the thing that didn't fit. And then she saw it. Not a face, a posture. Near the far end of the corridor, 30 meters out, a figure in a gray maintenance uniform was moving steadily toward the small conference room where, through the narrow window panel, she could see Calloway's dark jacket and the back of Carver's head. The conference room they'd put him in for questioning. The figure's right hand was in the front pocket of the uniform. She was running before she'd decided to run. Stop! Her voice came out at a volume that cut through the hallway noise, commanding and flat. The voice she hadn't used in 4 years, the one that came from below ordinary speech. Half the corridor turned toward the sound. The figure turned. She had expected a stranger. She had expected someone she'd never seen, a ghost in an institution she barely knew. The face that turned toward her was one she'd seen every day for 14 months. Delia Voss, charge nurse. The woman who had assigned Margaret to overflow 11 times. The woman who had shortened her name with a particular gentleness. The woman who had warned her that Weston's men had been asking questions. Her eyes met Margaret's, and in them there was no surprise, just the cold acknowledgement of two people who have both just run out of cover. Delia's hand was still in the pocket of the maintenance uniform, and she was still moving toward the conference room door. Margaret covered the distance and the time it took Delia to make a decision, and the decision Delia made was wrong. She pulled her hand from the pocket. Not a weapon, a key card. She swiped it against the conference room panel and the door clicked open, and she was moving through it before the lock had fully released, and Margaret hit the door with her shoulder 2 seconds behind her and came into the room to find Calloway on her feet, and Carver halfway out of his chair, and Delia standing with her back against the far wall, hand now empty, key card already pocketed, looking at the three of them with an expression that had settled into something Margaret recognized as a person who has run the calculations and found only one move left. "She has something in that pocket," Margaret said to Calloway. "I heard you in the hall." Calloway had her hand inside her jacket but hadn't drawn. She was reading Delia the same way Margaret had read her in the corridor, not as a nurse, as a threat. "Miss Voss, hands where I can see them." Delia looked at Margaret. Past Calloway, past Carver, directly at Margaret, and the expression on her face was not what Margaret had expected. Not defiance, not fear. Something more complicated, and in some ways worse. The look of someone who has been doing a terrible thing for a long time and is partly relieved that the doing is finished. "How long?" Margaret said. Delia held her gaze. 3 years. Carver made a sound. Margaret didn't look at him. "Hands," Calloway said again, harder. Delia raised both hands, left hand empty. Right hand, when it came up, held a capped syringe between 2 fingers. She set it on the table in front of her with the specific care of someone who knows what's inside it. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Calloway stepped forward, gloved before she reached the table. She'd pulled a glove from somewhere, efficient, prepared, and picked up the syringe without touching the plunger. She looked at it, then at Delia. "Potassium chloride?" "Lidocaine," Delia said. "High concentration. Cardiac arrest in 90 seconds. Looks like anesthetic complication in a post-op patient." She lowered her hands slowly. "Cleaner than potassium. Harder to isolate in a tox screen if the body is moved within 4 hours." The room was very quiet. "The body isn't in this room," Margaret said. Something moved across Delia's face. Not relief, the other thing. The thing that comes when a plan fails and takes the part of you that built it with it. "I saw the code gray and I thought that it worked," Calloway finished, "that Carver had cleared the floor." Delia said nothing. "Nadia Weston is not in room 412, Margaret said. "She hasn't been for the last 40 minutes. What happened next was not fast or dramatic. It was the slow, grinding work of containment, the kind that involves a lot of phone calls made in low voices and people moving through corridors with the particular purposeful quiet of a situation being managed. Calloway cuffed Delia to the table leg with the handcuff she had apparently been carrying this entire time as if she'd known she'd need it, which perhaps she had, and then she stepped into the corridor and made 3 calls in under 4 minutes. Margaret stood in the conference room with Carver and Delia and listened to the building continue its ordinary work around them. Monitor alarms from somewhere down the hall. A PA system page for a physician. The muffled sound of a family member's voice rising in the waiting area 2 floors below. A hospital full of people who had no idea what had just happened 30 meters from their ordinary Tuesday. Carver was looking at Delia. He had been looking at her since the syringe went on the table, with the expression of a man trying to reconstruct something he thought he understood, and finding the pieces don't fit the shape he expected. "You recruited me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man locating himself in a story he'd thought he knew. "Yes," Delia said. "The conference 2 years ago. The drinks after." "Yes." "You told me the network was—" He stopped, started differently. "You told me it was intelligence consulting, sensitive but legal. Private sector, retired officers, nothing operational. I know what I told you. You told me nobody would get hurt." Delia looked at her hands on the table. The handcuff against the table leg made a small sound when she moved. "I know. A 28-year-old woman almost died because of what I helped build. I know, Marcus. It was the first time Margaret had heard anyone use his given name in 14 months. It landed oddly in his room, too personal for the moment, like something from a different context showing up at the wrong address. Carver put his face in his hands. Margaret watched him and felt nothing that she'd expected to feel in this moment, which she wasn't sure she'd ever consciously imagined but would have thought would involve some satisfaction. There was none. He was a man who had been used and had let himself be used because he was smart enough to help and not smart enough to ask the right questions, and that was a more ordinary human failure than the version she'd built of him. She didn't forgive him for the 11 reassignments and the overridden assessments and the supply corridor conversations about nurses following orders. Those were his own choices, separate from Delia's network. But she didn't feel what she'd thought she'd feel. Calloway came back into the room. Building is being locked down. Soft lockdown. Patients aren't being moved, exits are monitored, nobody leaves without being checked. She looked at Margaret. Weston is on his way up. He wants to be with his daughter. 308, Margaret said. Garza and Reynolds are there. I'll take him. Calloway looked at Delia. Transport is 6 minutes out. She looked at the syringe still on the table. I need a chain of custody witness. I'll witness, Margaret said. You're not... I'm a licensed nurse who observed the subject enter this room with a medical instrument, place it on the table, and identify its contents verbally. That's a valid witness position. She met Calloway's eyes. I know how this works. Calloway looked at her for a moment. The same look Reeves had given her in the parking lot corridor, the look of someone recalibrating a category, and then nodded. The documentation took 20 minutes. Margaret was precise and thorough in the way she was precise and thorough about everything clinical, dates, times, exact phrasing, her position in the room at each point. Calloway asked her twice to slow down because she was dictating faster than the recorder could cleanly capture, and Margaret slowed down without comment. When transport arrived, 2 federal agents who came in through the loading dock to avoid the main corridors, Delia stood without being told. She had not spoken since the exchange with Carver. She walked between the agents with the measured pace of someone who has already made the internal transition, who has stopped being the person they were in this building and hasn't yet become whatever comes next. At the door she stopped, turned back, looked at Margaret. I did like you, she said. It came out tired rather than manipulative. I want you to know that. Margaret looked at her steadily. I know. I put you in overflow because I needed you away from the clinical floors, away from Carver, away from the medication systems. You were too observant. A pause. Every time you caught something, I moved you further away. I know that too, Margaret said. I'm sorry. Margaret held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then, go with them, Delia. The door closed. Carver was still at the table. He looked up at Margaret, and he looked like something had left his face, not just the authority or the performance, but the specific energy of a man who has spent years managing a room and no longer sees the point. He was just a person now, middle-aged, tired, scared of what happens next. What's going to happen to me, he said. That's not my question to answer. You could... He stopped. What? You clearly have more weight here than overflow nursing staff. You could say something to Calloway, to Weston. She looked at him. I could. He waited. You accessed Nadia Weston's records at 3 a.m, she said. You passed her room assignment to someone who was planning to murder her. You have to live with what you cooperate with, Dr. Carver. That's not mine to fix. She picked up her clipboard. She had been carrying it through this entire thing, the same clipboard she'd had when Carver first appeared in the overflow corridor, which now seemed like something from a different era, and walked out. Weston was already in room 308 when she got there. He was sitting in the chair beside Nadia's bed with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped in front of him, and he was looking at his daughter with an expression that had nothing military in it, just a father in a recovery room processing the specific and particular terror of almost. He looked up when Margaret entered. Garza and Reynolds had moved to the corridor, giving him space. She's stable, Margaret said. Dr. Park wants to see her at 6, but the numbers have been good since the transfer. Reeves told me what you did. He paused. What all of it? Moving her, the syringe, Voss. Calloway did most of the real work. Don't do that. She looked at him. Don't minimize it, he said. You've been doing that your whole career and it hasn't served you. He held her gaze. You identified the bleed before imaging. You controlled the dog. You moved my daughter 40 minutes before someone walked into that room with a loaded syringe. You stopped that person from reaching this room. He paused. Own it. Margaret looked at Nadia, the even breathing, the steady numbers, the particular fragile ordinariness of a young woman asleep in a hospital bed who didn't know yet how close the margin had been. She's going to be fine. Because of you. Because of a lot of people. Weston leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing what to say next from a longer list than they're going to use. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. I'll try. Are you happy here, at this hospital, this life? The question sat in the room like something physical. Margaret had not expected it, which was unusual. She generally expected things. She looked at the monitors and thought about the answer, which was more complicated than yes or no, and less complicated than she usually made it. It's mine, she said finally. That matters more than happy. Weston nodded slowly. After Navarre. After everything. You built something from nothing, and you protected it. He met her eyes. I can respect that. But? She heard the word before he said it. But you've been operating in a broken environment. Someone has been systematically keeping you out of the positions where you're useful. And part of the reason Delia Voss could do what she did for 3 years is that nobody in this hospital looked at the charge nurse carefully enough. And you were the person with the eyes to see it, and you were in overflow. I was in overflow because I made Carver uncomfortable, Margaret said. Yes, because you were better than him. He said it flatly as a fact rather than a compliment. That's going to stop. She looked at him carefully. I told you last night, I'm not going to reassign you. I'm not going to make calls. He held up one hand. I'm going to make a statement to hospital administration about the quality of care my daughter received. I'm going to be specific about who did what and when. After that, what they do with it is their decision. A pause. But I'm going to be specific. Margaret thought about this. It wasn't the same as Weston pulling strings. It was a man telling the truth about what he'd seen, which was something she couldn't object to and hadn't asked for and turned out to be exactly the right shape. Okay, she said. She left Weston with his daughter and walked to the end of the corridor and sat in a plastic chair near the window. Outside, Delwood continued its afternoon. Traffic on the bridge, a ferry moving across the water, the ordinary motion of a city that didn't know what had happened in a hospital on its edge. She had 45 minutes left on her shift. She would go back to overflow and finish it. Reeves found her there. He came down the hall without urgency and sat in the chair beside her, and they looked out the window for a moment without talking, which was something she found she didn't mind. Calloway's got Voss in transport, he said, and she found the supply cabinet. There were 17 documents in it. Identity packages, full legends, complete with medical history files generated through Harlow General's system. Voss had been seeding them for 14 months. Every new patient admission, she had a protocol for flagging records that could be cannibalized for identities. He paused. People who died without next of kin. People with gaps in their documented history. How many other hospitals? Calloway's working that, but Harlow General was the most active node by volume. He looked at her. You were here 14 months. She was running it the whole time. I know. You didn't see it. No. That was the part she'd been sitting with since the conference room. The charge nurse who moved her around the board like a chess piece, using the underestimation as cover. Margaret had been so focused on Carver as the variable in the room that she hadn't looked at the person running the room. I see what I'm supposed to see. Same as everyone. That's not a failure, Reeves said. It's not a success either. He didn't argue with that. She liked him a little better for it. What happens to Carver, she said. Full cooperation gets him consideration. Calloway thinks he'll face charges, but he won't see significant time. He's too useful to prosecute into silence. He paused. He gave them everything. Names, dates, the whole methodology of how Voss brought him in and what he provided. He provided Nadia's room assignment. Yes. She looked at the window. He's going to lose his license regardless. Almost certainly. She thought about Marcus Carver, the corner office, the published papers, the years of building something large enough to feel invincible inside. All of it assembled from a particular combination of talent and smallness, the way some people build careers from the gap between what they're capable of and what they're afraid of. He had been afraid of people who made him feel insufficient. He had solved that problem by removing them from his proximity. It had worked until it didn't. "He'll land somewhere," she said. Not generously, just accurately. Men like Carver usually did. She was back in overflow at 4:15, finishing the last of her documentation for the day, when Dr. Sandra Osei appeared in the doorway. Osei, the cardiologist, the compact, irritated woman who had responded to Harold Finch's cardiac event in the morning, which was this morning, the same morning, though it felt like 3 days ago, and had asked for Margaret's name. She stood in the overflow doorway with her hands in the pockets of her white coat and looked at the state of the bay with the critical eye of someone evaluating real estate. "You've been busy," she said. "Routine shift," Margaret said. "That's not what I heard." Osei came in, looked around, sat on the edge of the counter. "I heard you moved a post-op patient off her floor without attending authorization." "I documented a monitoring concern." "I read the note. It was plausible." Osei paused. "It was also smart. If you'd flagged it through me or Park, there would have been a delay, and she needed to be moved before anyone could verify the concern." Margaret looked at her. "You know about Nadia Weston. The whole 4th floor knows about the federal agents and the lockdown. The details will filter through by morning, but I don't need details." She met Margaret's eyes. "I need to know if you're going to stay in overflow." "That depends on what's available." "There's a senior floor rotation that's been sitting empty for 2 months. Carver was blocking candidates." Osei looked at her without any particular warmth. She didn't seem like a warm person by default, which Margaret found restful. "I'd like you to apply for it. Tomorrow, when administration has their morning meeting and Carver's absence from the building is being explained, I would like your application to be on the table." "Why?" "Because you caught a NSTEMI that was triaged as a sprained wrist, you stabilized a hemorrhaging patient when the room was frozen, and you correctly identified an operative threat in a hospital environment while still managing a patient transfer and 4 hours of clinical work." She paused. "And because Carver's been blocking people like you for years, and I've been too politic about it, and I'm tired of being politic." A beat. "It's not a favor. You'd actually have to do the work." "I'm aware of what the rotation involves," Margaret said. "Good." Osei stood, tugged her coat straight. "The application form is on the intranet. It takes about 20 minutes. She moved toward the door, stopped, looked back. "Holloway, the NSTEMI patient. Finch." "What about him?" "He had his angiogram at 2. 73% blockage in the LAD. He's going to need a stent. Without the intervention this morning..." She didn't finish, didn't need to. "He asked one of the cardiologists who caught it. I told him a nurse named Holloway." She left. Margaret sat for a moment in the overflow bay with the late afternoon light coming through the single window and did nothing in particular for about 40 seconds, which was more stillness than she usually allowed herself during a shift. Then she pulled up the intranet on the bay terminal and found the application. It took 19 minutes. Calloway came to find her at 5:50 in the parking lot while Margaret was waiting for the bus. She drove a government-issue Tahoe, dark gray, and pulled up alongside the bus stop with the window down. She looked like someone who had been awake for 22 hours and was functioning on mechanism rather than energy, which was accurate. "I wanted to tell you before it hits the news," she said. Margaret turned from the bus stop. "How bad?" "We executed search warrants on 3 locations associated with the network at 4:30 this afternoon. Arrests in 2 states. The identity document operation goes further than Harlow General. We're looking at records from 9 facilities across 4 states, approximately 300 false identities generated over a 4-year period." She paused. "Some of those identities are currently being used by individuals we've been looking for on federal warrants." "How long before it's public?" "DOJ is briefing tomorrow morning. It'll be all over by noon." She looked at Margaret steadily. "Your name is not in the official record in any operational capacity. You're a witness, a nurse who provided care for Nadia Weston and observed Voss enter the conference room." That's accurate. It is. I was careful about it. Calloway's hands rested on the wheel, not gripping. She was tired enough that even the performance of composure had mostly dropped off. You could have a larger designation in this if you wanted. There are people who'd argue for it. I don't want it. I know. She looked out the windshield. Reeves said you'd say that. Reeves is starting to read me accurately. A corner of Calloway's mouth moved. He's had practice. 7 years of wondering what happened to the pilot who pulled 2 men out of Navarre. She looked back at Margaret. For what it's worth. What I saw today. The way you work. Whatever you were before, what you are now is not a smaller version of it. Margaret thought about that. The bus was visible 3 blocks away, coming slowly through traffic. Delia, she said, what does she face? Federal conspiracy, attempted murder, identity document fraud, wire fraud. Minimum 20 years, probably more depending on what the network case adds. Calloway paused. She cooperated once she was in transport, gave us 3 additional names in the network before we reached the federal building. She said it without admiration or condemnation, just facts. She's intelligent. She knows the math. She was always intelligent, Margaret said. The bus pulled up. The door opened. Margaret picked up her bag. Holloway? Calloway's voice came through the window as she stepped toward the bus door. There's something you should know about Delia's recruitment of Carver. Margaret paused. She told us how she ran it, the methodology, how she identified candidates and brought them in. A pause. She said she almost recruited you first, 14 months ago when you started. She looked at your file, watched you work for 2 weeks, and decided you were too hard to predict. The bus driver was looking at her with the expression of a man with a schedule. She said, Calloway chose the words carefully. She said you were the kind of person who eventually finds the thing that doesn't fit. So she kept you in overflow and kept you away from everything and hoped you'd quit. A pause. She said she should have known overflow wouldn't be enough. Margaret looked at the bus door, then at Calloway. Then she got on the bus. She found a seat by the window and watched Calloway's Tahoe pull away from the curb, and she thought about Delia Voss saying she liked her and meaning it, and running an identity fraud network through the same institution for 14 months while meaning it. She thought about the particular human capacity for holding 2 completely contradictory things at the same time and functioning as if they don't cancel each other out. The bus moved through Delwood in the early evening light. At the 3rd stop, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not Calloway, not Reeves. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male. Careful. The specific careful of someone who is measuring every word. Ms. Holloway, it said. My name isn't important. What's important is that you understand something about what was found in that supply cabinet today. She said nothing. Let him continue. 17 documents, the voice said. That's what they found. 17. A pause. There were 22. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. 5 identity packages were removed from that cabinet 6 hours before your federal investigator arrived. 5 people who now exist, completely clean, inside the system. Another pause. One of them is in Delwood, has been for 3 weeks, and they know your name, Ms. Holloway. Not the name in the employment file. A beat. The other one. The bus rolled through a red light at Clement and Fifth, Delwood moving past the window in the early dark, ordinary and continuous and suddenly very large. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because the network doesn't like loose ends, the voice said, and you've become one. The line was quiet for a moment. And because I'm not sure I like what I'm part of anymore, but I'm not sure enough to do more than this. A pause. Be careful who you walk past, Lieutenant Hart. The call ended. The bus continued. Margaret sat very still with her phone in her hand and looked out the window at Delwood, the repair shops and the laundromats and the taco place with the broken sign, and understood that she was looking at it differently than she had this morning. Same city, same route home, same ordinary world. Somewhere in it, a person was walking around with a manufactured life and her real name, and she was the only one who knew. She got off the bus 1 stop early, not from panic, Margaret didn't panic, hadn't in a long time, had burned that particular reflex out of herself in circumstances she didn't revisit. She got off early because the bus stop closest to her apartment was a fixed point, a predictable arrival. And predictable arrivals are problems when someone in your city knows your real name and has had 3 weeks to learn your patterns. She walked the extra 6 blocks through a route she hadn't used before, varying her pace, taking a turn that added 2 minutes, stopping once to look in the window of a closed hardware store as if she were interested in the display and using the reflection to read the street behind her. Nothing obvious. But obvious wasn't the measure. The people who were good at this, and whoever had built those 5 identity packages was good at this, weren't obvious. She called Reeves while she walked. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was still operational, which meant the day hadn't ended for his team the way days were supposed to end. Talk to me. I got a call. Unknown number, mail, said the supply cabinet had 22 documents, not 17. 5 were removed before Calloway's team got there. A beat of silence. She could hear him thinking through it. You believe the caller? The number was clean, too clean. No provider trace, not a burner, something more sophisticated. And the information was specific. 22 minus 17 is 5. He wasn't guessing. She crossed an intersection against the light, watching the car that had been idling near the corner move when she moved. Maybe nothing. She took note of it. He said one of the 5 is in Delwood, has been for 3 weeks. He said they know my name, my real name. Reeves. He'd already started moving. She could hear it in the change of background sound. Are you home? Not yet. Don't go home yet. Where are you? She gave him the cross street. Stay on the line. I'm calling Calloway on the other channel. He paused. And Marg, the caller. You said he volunteered the information. Why? He said he wasn't sure he liked what he was part of anymore. She thought about the voice, the careful weights it put on words. He sounded like someone at the edge of a decision he hadn't fully made yet, or someone running a secondary play. Yes, she said, or that. Basin. Calloway met her at a diner 4 blocks from the cross street, arriving before Margaret did, which meant she'd been closer than she'd let on. She was in the same clothes from the hospital, the federal agent version of Margaret's granola bar at her desk, and had coffee in front of her that she wasn't drinking. She listened to Margaret relay the call without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she turned her coffee cup a quarter rotation, stopped it, turned it back. A small, repetitive motion that Margaret had come to understand was how Calloway processed things she didn't like. 5 packages, she said. That's what he said. We missed 5. She said it to herself more than to Margaret. The flat acknowledgement of a professional accepting an error without flinching away from it. The cabinet had a false bottom. We found it, but we assumed it was empty. Someone had already been there. When? I'll need to pull the building's access log for the 2nd floor. But if they were there 6 hours before we executed the warrant, she stopped, turned the cup again. Someone inside the investigative loop. Or someone who was watching the building and saw Carver get pulled, Margaret said. If they were monitoring and they saw federal agents on the 3rd floor, 6 hours is enough time to run a retrieval. Calloway looked at her. That's more likely. And more manageable. She exhaled. The 5 packages. Each one would have a name, a medical history, a documented residential history, enough to pass a standard background check, open a bank account, sign a lease. She paused. Whoever holds them is already embedded. 3 weeks is enough to build routine, pay rent, make neighbors. The caller said Delwood. Delwood is 340,000 people. I know. Calloway's phone was already in her hand. She made 2 calls in quick succession, terse and precise, giving instructions Margaret could follow enough to understand that a records query was being run on every residential lease signed in the Delwood metro area in the last 3 weeks, cross-referenced against names from the identity package template that Voss had used. It was the kind of search that would take hours and return hundreds of results. Calloway knew that. She made the call anyway because you do the work even when the work is imperfect, because imperfect work is still work, and work is still the only thing that produces outcomes. In the meantime, Calloway said, phone down, looking at Margaret, you're not staying in your apartment tonight. I know. I can put you in a hotel. I know some places. Margaret said. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then, the caller. He said they know your real name. That means the network's intelligence on you goes beyond Harlow General. They knew to look for Evelyn Hart underneath Margaret Holloway. She paused. That's a different level of access than Voss could generate. I know that too. Someone ran your legend, the constructed one, Holloway, and found the seam. Calloway was very still. That's federal intelligence capacity, not a private network. Or a private network with a federal asset inside it. They sat with that for a moment. The diner was half empty, the dinner rush not yet arrived, the particular in-between quiet of a place that served good enough coffee to keep people comfortable without being interesting enough to make them stay. This is bigger than Harlow General, Calloway said. It was always bigger than Harlow General, Margaret said. Bunktown. She slept 4 hours in a room at the Waypoint Motor Inn on the eastern edge of Delwood, a place she'd identified 6 months after moving here as a fallback option. Not because she'd expected to need it, but because identifying fallback options was something her nervous system did automatically, the way other people noticed exits in rooms. The room smelled like industrial cleaning product, and the shower pressure was insufficient, and she slept hard and without dreams, which was either a sign of exhaustion or of the particular mental discipline she'd spent years building and maintained without thinking about it the way you maintain a habit that's become structural. She was up at 4:30, called Reeves. Calloway's team got a hit on the record search at 2 a.m., he said. He sounded like he hadn't slept. Residential lease, Delwood, signed 18 days ago. The name on the lease is Paul Merritt. The Social Security number attached to that name belonged to a patient who died at Harlow General 11 months ago. His name was actually Vincent Galway, 64, no next of kin, no documented family. Where? Apartment on Crestline near the eastern waterfront, 4th floor. She was already calculating distance from the motor inn. 7 minutes on foot. Calloway is running the approach this morning, Reeves said. She wants you away from it. I understand. I mean it, she said specifically. Tell her I understand, Margaret said. I'm not going to the Crestline address. A pause. Is she going in with a team? 6 agents, tactical support, 6 a.m. Hard entry. He'll be gone. A silence. What? The caller warned me at... She checked the time. 17 hours ago. Even if the caller didn't warn the subject directly, the network will have protocols for a burned asset. If someone reached out to me, it means the network already knows the node is compromised. They've had 17 hours. She paused. The apartment will be empty. They'll find a clean residence and no trace. She heard Reeves relay this, muffled, hand over the phone. A back and forth she couldn't fully hear. Then, Calloway says they go in anyway, for documentation. She's right, go in anyway. But she should be looking for what he left, not who's there. What do you mean, what he left? People who build false identities and then abandon them leave the seams showing. What he took, what he couldn't take, what he was in the middle of when he had to move. It's a record. She thought about it. Calloway knows this. She says, another muffled exchange. Then Reeves came back, and his voice had shifted slightly, the way it did when he was relaying something that surprised him. She says you're right, and she already pulled a forensic team. And she says... He paused. She says if you want to be at the debrief at 10 a.m., she'll allow it. Not invite. Allow. Margaret noticed the word and accepted it. Tell her I'll be there, she said. She went back to her apartment first. Daylight now, the city awake and ordinary, and she walked through the building's entrance with the same attention she'd given the street the night before. The lobby, the stairs, the hallway. Everything was quiet, and as it should be, and slightly dingy in the morning light, the way things are when you see them without the flattery of evening. She changed clothes, made coffee that was better than Harlow General's, and stood at the window. The city moved below her. It was just a city. It had been threatening and ordinary at the same time last night, and it was the same now. And that was the thing about living inside a situation. The situation doesn't change the city, it just changes what you're able to see. She thought about Delia Voss, who had moved through Harlow General for 3 years saying she liked Margaret and meaning it, and also running a document fraud operation through the same building. She thought about Marcus Carver, who who had treated Margaret as furniture for 14 months and had been used as a tool by someone far more patient and methodical than he was. She thought about the unnamed caller on the bus, still unknown, still a variable, the person at the edge of a decision who had chosen to make one call and nothing more. She thought about Nadia Weston, sedated in room 308, who would wake up not knowing any of this and would be told a version of it eventually, carefully, by people who would decide what she needed to know and in what order. She thought about Harold Finch, whose LAD had been 73% blocked, and who was probably eating breakfast right now in a cardiac ward, not knowing how differently the morning could have gone if a nurse in overflow had been watching her clipboard instead of his sternum. She drank her coffee and went to the debrief. The federal field office was a floor in a building that looked like it sold insurance from the outside, which was either deliberate or coincidental, and probably both. Calloway's team occupied the fourth floor, open plan, busy, the particular controlled disorder of people managing a large case that had accelerated faster than they'd planned. Margaret came in with a visitor badge and Reeves at her side and sat at a table in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and someone's breakfast sandwich. Calloway came in 6 minutes late, dropped a file on the table, and sat. "Apartment was empty," she said. He'd been gone for at least 12 hours before entry. The bed hadn't been slept in. "What did you find?" Margaret said. "More than I expected." Calloway opened the file. He left in a hurry, but he couldn't take everything. There was a laptop, wiped, but forensics pulled residual cache that shows communication with 3 email addresses we've been tracking for 8 months as suspected network nodes. First direct link between those addresses and a physical location. She looked up. "That's significant." "The caller gave you that," Margaret said. "Indirectly, yes." Calloway paused. "I'm working on the theory that the caller is someone inside the network who has decided the operation is compromised enough that cooperation is worth the risk. He's not ready to identify himself. The call was carefully done, no trace, but he gave you enough to find the laptop." "He wanted us to find it," Margaret said. "I think so." "Which means he left it there intentionally." Calloway looked at her. "That had occurred to me." "Which means he's still making decisions. He's managing this." "Yes. And he's going to make contact again." Calloway looked at her for a long moment. The room was quiet. Outside, through the glass partition, someone was on the phone, voice carrying without the words being distinct. "Possibly, and if he does, it'll probably be to you." Margaret sat with that. "I want you to be positioned to receive it," Calloway said. "Not operationally. You're a witness, a civilian, a nurse, on paper. But if he calls again, I want you to know what to ask and how to ask it. You want me wired. I want you prepared." Calloway leaned forward slightly. "There's a difference. You'd have full awareness of what's happening and complete control over the conversation. You can terminate it at any point." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be an asset. I'm asking you to be yourself, in a room where we can hear it." Margaret thought about her apartment on the east side of Delwood, her 3 plants, her 2 buses. The 14 months of overflow shifts and granola bars and supply corridors, and Delia Voss moving her around the board, and Harold Finch's sternum, and a dog that remembered her after 7 years. She thought about what she'd said to Weston. "It's mine. That matters more than happy." She thought about what the caller had said. "I'm not sure I like what I'm part of anymore." She understood that. The being part of something and not liking it, and not yet knowing if not liking is enough to make you move. She understood it from a direction he probably hadn't considered. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." The public news broke at 11:40. She heard it on a small television mounted in the corner of a waiting room where she was sitting between phone briefings, a DOJ press conference, a spokesperson reading from a statement in the flat cadence of prepared language, announcing coordinated arrests in 2 states, a federal indictment covering identity document fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder, a network operating through medical institutions across 4 states, 17 individuals charged. The spokesperson did not name the hospital. She did not name Admiral Weston. She did not name Delia Voss by name, but described a senior medical professional as among the primary defendants. She did not name Margaret Holloway. She said the investigation had been supported by a confidential witness whose actions had been material to the outcome. She said nothing further about that. Margaret watched it and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not vindication exactly. Vindication requires an audience, and she had spent 4 years specifically not having one. Not relief, because the situation was not resolved. Something quieter. The recognition that what had happened was real, that it had mattered, that someone in an official capacity in front of a camera was acknowledging that the events of the last 32 hours had weight. Reeves was beside her. He watched the screen, then watched her. "You're not going to say anything, are you?" he said. "About what?" "About any of it." He paused. "The press conference. Your name not being in it." "My name not being in it is the correct outcome," she said. "Why would I say anything about that?" He shook his head slowly, with the expression of someone who has been trying to categorize a person for several days and kept finding the category insufficient. Weston came to the field office at 2 in the afternoon. He arrived with Garza and Reynolds, both now in suits rather than civilian clothes, which was either a promotion or a formality. He shook Calloway's hand. He reviewed the current status briefing in the same conference room where Margaret had spent most of the morning. He asked 2 questions that were specific and tactical and demonstrated that he had read the file before arriving, which was the kind of thing that meant he was a serious person and not just a person with a serious rank. Then he asked to speak to Margaret alone. They sat at one end of the conference table with the file closed between them and the sounds of the field office muffled behind the glass partition. "Nadia's awake," he said. "How is she?" Asking questions nobody wants to answer yet. A brief pause that was not quite a smile. "She's like that." He looked at his hands on the table, then at Margaret. "She wants to thank you." "She doesn't need to, but she wants to. You can tell her that when you see her, but she'll do it anyway." He paused. She's a good person. Better than she knows, probably. She went into environmental law specifically to have nothing to do with the military. And then this happens, and she's asking me to tell the nurses who saved her life that she appreciates it, in exactly the polite formal language she uses when she's trying not to be emotional. Margaret looked at him. He loved his daughter in the particular way of a parent who has spent years being afraid of something happening to her, and has just had the fear realized and survived it. It was visible in the way he talked about her, factual, controlled, the emotion showing at the edges like light under a door. "I'll go see her this afternoon," Margaret said. He nodded. Then, "The application for the senior rotation. Osei told me you submitted it." "She asked me to." "I know she did. I also know she had to move 3 interdepartmental objections to get the position to open, and she moved them yesterday afternoon while you were doing everything else." He paused. "She's been trying to pry that position open for 8 months. She moved it in one afternoon when she decided she had a reason." "She has good timing." "She has good judgment," Weston said. "About people. That's rarer." He looked at her directly. "Administration is meeting tomorrow morning about Carver's departure and the operational security review the hospital has to conduct as a result of Voss's arrest. Osei is presenting your application in that meeting. She's also presenting a full account of your clinical actions over the last 32 hours. She doesn't need to. She knows that. She wants to." He held her eyes. "Let people do things for you, Holloway. It's not a transaction. It's not weakness." He paused. "You've been operating alone for 4 years. You built something that worked. But you built it small because you were afraid of what building it larger would cost." He said it without judgment, just the direct observation of someone who had read her accurately and decided honesty was the right use of the moment. "I don't know what it cost you to disappear after Navarre. I know what it cost other people, and I imagine those aren't equal numbers." She looked at the table for a moment. "It wasn't about cost," she said finally. "I was tired. I wanted to be a person who went home at the end of a shift and ate dinner and wasn't part of something that required me to be anywhere other than where I was." She paused. "That's not noble. It's just what I wanted." And it worked, mostly, until it stopped working. She met his eyes. "This morning I submitted a nursing rotation application. I'm going to see your daughter this afternoon and let her thank me, which is going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to help a federal investigator potentially receive a phone call from a man I've never met who may or may not be making the hardest decision of his life. She paused. That's what's happening. Beyond that, I don't know. That's honest, he said. You asked for honest. He nodded once, slowly. I have one more thing to say, and then I'll leave you to it. He straightened slightly, not military posture exactly, but the posture of a man who wants what he says next to land with appropriate weight. 7 years ago, 2 men came home because you made a decision in a burning wreck in a situation that was already lost. One of them has 2 children who are alive because he is alive. The other one, he stopped, started again. Sergeant Pyle didn't make it, but he made it home. His family got to say goodbye. A pause. I know you know this. I know it probably doesn't change the arithmetic for you. I'm saying it anyway because people should say the true things even when they're late. Margaret sat with this. She thought about the arithmetic and he was right. It didn't change it. Not in the way that made anything feel lighter. But she thought about Corporal Adkins' daughter named Evie, and she thought about the particular way Weston had just said his daughter was like that, asking questions better than she knows, and she thought about the true things that are late and still matter because they're true. Thank you, she said. It came out without performance, which was the only way she knew how to say it. He stood, extended his hand. She shook it. You never stopped being who you were, he said. You just changed the location. What? She went to see Nadia at 4. Room 308 smelled less like fresh paint now and more like hospital, the antiseptic, and the warmth of an occupied room, and the particular smell of someone who'd been on IV fluids for a day and a half. Nadia was sitting up, which was more than Margaret had expected. She had her father's eyes, but not his compression. She looked at things directly without the careful management Weston put between himself and the world, which was probably what becoming an environmental lawyer rather than a soldier looked like from the inside. She looked at Margaret when she came in, said nothing for a moment. You're shorter than I imagined, she said. Margaret stopped just inside the door. You were unconscious. Reeves described you. He said... She paused, reconsidered. Never mind what he said. Sit down. Margaret sat. I don't remember anything from the crash, Nadia said. I remember the drive, and then I remember waking up here with a drain tube in my side and my father holding my hand, which he hasn't done since I was 8. She looked at the window. He told me some of it, not all of it, but enough. She looked back at Margaret. The dog. You spoke to him and he sat down. He recognized something familiar. Reeves said the dog's unit worked in the same theater you did, 7 years ago. She said it carefully, feeling the shape of the information she'd been given. He said you did things he isn't allowed to tell me. People say that about a lot of things. Nadia almost smiled. It was a good face for almost smiling, something wry underneath the directness. I'm going to say thank you and you're going to deflect, so I'll say it fast. Thank you. Not just for the bleed, for moving me when you did, for knowing something was wrong before the evidence was complete. She paused. My father said that's what you do. You know things before the evidence is complete. It's not knowing, Margaret said. It's recognizing patterns. It's different. Is it? She thought about it honestly. Sometimes. They sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who don't need to fill space. Outside the room, the hospital continued, someone's meal tray being collected, a nurse's shoes on the hallway floor, a distant elevator. I'm an environmental lawyer, Nadia said. I spend most of my time arguing with petrochemical companies about watershed contamination. It is, she considered, not the same as what you do. No. Is it weird? Being a nurse after, she stopped. Sorry, you don't have to answer that. It's not weird, Margaret said. She thought about how to say the rest of it. Medicine is the same idea from a different angle. You put yourself between something harmful and something that matters. The tools are different. The principle isn't. She paused. It took me a while to see that, but it's true. Nadia looked at her, a long, direct look, the kind that in another person might feel invasive. In her, it just felt like attention. My father's going to try to stay connected. He won't be able to help it. That's going to be complicated for you, isn't it? Probably. He's not good at letting things go once they matter to him. She smiled more fully now. It's both his best quality and genuinely exhausting. A pause. I'm the same. I'll manage, Margaret said. I know you will. Nadia shifted carefully, wincing with the particular careful movement of abdominal surgery at day 2. For what it's worth, I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you decided to stay in a place where people were treating you badly, even though you didn't have to stay. A pause. Most people don't stay. Most people find somewhere easier. Margaret thought about 14 months of overflow and granola bars and supply corridors, and Delia Voss moving her around the board like a piece in a game she hadn't been told the rules of. She thought about Harold Finch and the NSTEMI that almost wasn't caught. She thought about the administrator meeting tomorrow morning where Ose would walk into a room and say true things in front of people who would have to hear them. I stayed because it was mine, she said. That's not heroic, it's just stubborn. Nadia laughed, a real one, which she immediately regretted because of the drain tube, her hand going to her side. Don't make me do that. I'll try, Margaret said, and stood to leave. The caller phoned again at 9:17 that evening. She was in her apartment. Calloway's team had swept it that afternoon, found nothing, cleared it for her return, and she was eating toast over the sink because she hadn't had a real meal since the previous morning, and toast was what was in the apartment, and she was too tired to have opinions about food. She answered on the second ring. Calloway was live on another line, listening. You didn't go to the Crestline apartment, the caller said. No preamble. No, Margaret said. Why not? Because you didn't send me there. You sent me to Calloway. She put the toast down. And because the person in that apartment was already gone. A silence. You're more careful than I expected. You said they know my name. People who know my name have been a problem for me before. She kept her voice level and conversational. You called again. That means you made a decision. A longer silence this time. She let it sit. This was the moment where pressure was wrong. This was the moment where the thing that was already moving needed room to complete its motion. The network is contracting, he said finally. When a node goes down, the rest tighten. People disappear. Evidence disappears. We've done it before and they know how to do it cleanly. He paused. I've been part of 4 contractions. I know what happens to people who are considered risks. You're considered a risk. I warned you. That made me one. He said it without self-pity. Just the flat factual accounting of someone who knows their position on a board. He stopped. Started differently. I have documents. Not the identity packages. Operational records. Communications between the network's upper tier and the federal assets they compromised. If those records reach the right people, they dismantle the upper tier, she said. They dismantle everything that Calloway's case didn't reach. Everything above Voss. A pause. She wasn't the architect, she was a node. A very good node, but a node. Margaret felt something settle into place, the remaining piece of the shape she'd been building since the supply cabinet. Since the 17 documents that should have been 22, since the voice of a man who didn't like what he was part of and had decided, finally, that not liking was enough. What do you need? She said. I need someone to walk into a federal field office with me, he said. Not as a witness, not through a lawyer. I need someone who can stand next to me when I walk in there and not be afraid of what happens after. A pause. I know that's a significant ask. Why me? A long silence. When he spoke again, the careful weights on the words were still there, but something underneath them had shifted, the quality of a person who has stopped performing and started talking. Because you did what I'm trying to do. You walked away from a thing you were part of, and you built something different, and you were still standing when it found you again, and you didn't... He stopped. You didn't collapse. You didn't run. You did the next thing that needed doing. She stood at her kitchen window with toast getting cold on the counter and the city below her and Calloway listening on another line. And she thought about this man, unknown, unnamed, somewhere in Delwood or already gone from it, sitting with documents that could dismantle something large and terrible and trying to decide if the person he'd become was capable of the thing the person he was trying to be would do. She thought about being tired. She thought about small and stable. She thought about the apartment with 3 plants and 2 buses and granola bars and supply corridors. She thought about Nadia Weston saying most people find somewhere easier. "Tell me where you are," Margaret said. His name was Thomas Bray. He was 41 years old and had spent 11 years as an analyst in a private intelligence firm that had somewhere along the way stopped being a firm and started being a network. The kind of change that happens gradually enough that you don't mark the moment when you crossed from one thing into another. He was not a violent person. He had never been in a military theater or a burning wreck or a trauma bay. He had sat in rooms with computers and produced documents and told himself that what the documents enabled was someone else's responsibility. And he had told himself this for 11 years and had been, on some level, never fully convinced by it. He was sitting in a rented car in a parking structure on the west side of Delwood when Margaret arrived, with Calloway's team positioned in 3 locations around the structure that Thomas Bray did not know about, and that Margaret had been briefed on in the car on the way over. He was smaller than his voice. That was the first thing. People often were. The voice on the phone carries a kind of shapeless potential that the actual person can't quite fill. He had the look of someone who had stopped sleeping normally some weeks ago and had been managing on mechanisms since then, which Margaret recognized. He looked at her when she opened the passenger door and sat down. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He had a laptop bag on his lap and both hands flat on it. "The documents are encrypted. I have the keys. I need to give them in person to someone with the right clearance. If I send them and something happens to me..." "Calloway has the clearance," Margaret said. "She's here." He looked at her, really looked, the way people look when they're checking whether they've been set up. She held his gaze and did nothing, because doing nothing is sometimes the only honest answer, and he needed honest. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She got out of the car. He got out of the car. They walked together across the parking structure toward the stairwell, and she was aware of Calloway's team closing quietly from 3 directions, and she was aware of Thomas Bray breathing unevenly beside her, and she was aware that this was the end of something, not just the case, not just the last 32 hours, but a longer thing. The years of being an overflow, of being moved around a board, of being the person in the room that nobody looked at hard enough to see. All of it ending not in a moment of recognition, but in a parking structure with bad fluorescent lighting, and a man who had spent 11 years telling himself someone else's responsibility and had finally run out of room to believe it. Calloway met them at the stairwell door. She looked at Bray, at the laptop bag, at Margaret. "Thomas Bray," she said. "Yes," he said. "You have records pertaining to upper-tier network communications?" "Yes." She looked at Margaret. One look, brief, then back to Bray. "Then let's go somewhere we can talk." The final arrests happened over 3 days. Margaret read about most of them secondhand. She was at Harlow General for 2 of those days, finishing her existing patient load, completing documentation, showing up to the administration meeting where OC presented the rotation application, and where 2 board members who had been Marcus Carver's institutional allies sat in uncharacteristic silence while OC walked through a precise, documented account of events from the last 48 hours. Not performatively, not with anger, just the facts, in order, with the clinical clarity of a person who has evidence and doesn't need volume. The rotation was approved in the same meeting. Margaret heard about it from Delia's replacement at the charge desk, a temporary hire named Patrice, who had the energy of someone who hadn't inherited any of the previous charge nurse's institutional history and found everything to be a straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. Patrice told her with the enthusiasm of genuine good news, and Margaret thanked her and went back to the patient she was with and finished the assessment and documented it and went to the next. 6 upper-tier network members were arrested across 3 states in the 72 hours following Bray's cooperation. 2 of them were former federal employees. One was a sitting contractor with active clearances who would lose them within the week. Bray's documents provided the communication chain that Calloway's team had been missing for 18 months. The link between the medical record fraud at the ground level and the false identity distribution to the operational level above it. The network had been using manufactured medical identities to place people inside institutions. hospitals, universities, 2 regulatory agencies. People who existed on paper in the way that mattered: insurance records, residential history, employment verification, but who had been built from the digital remains of people who had died in hospital beds without family to notice the gap. It was a particular kind of theft that Margaret had not previously considered, and she considered it now. The dead don't know what's taken from them. The living institutions that process their records don't know either. Only the person who knows where to look in the seam between death and documentation can find it, or the person who built the seam in the first place. Delia Voss pleaded not guilty at her arraignment on the second day, which was the expected first move. Her attorney was good. It wouldn't matter. Calloway had 17 documents, a syringe with her fingerprints on it, Thomas Bray's corroborating communications, and Marcus Carver's full testimony. She pleaded not guilty because that is what you do when you have a good attorney and time to run the process, and the process would run, and at the end of it, the weight of the evidence would be what it was. Marcus Carver resigned from Harlow General on the afternoon of the first day. He did not issue a public statement. His office was packed by the end of the week. His 2 research papers remained published in journals that would eventually note the circumstances of his departure in an editorial update. He cooperated fully with the federal investigation and would face reduced charges as a result: conspiracy counts, accessory considerations, a negotiated outcome that would cost him his license and several years of his life, and the specific kind of public unraveling that men who have built careers on authority find harder to survive than any sentence. He did not contact Margaret. She had not expected him to. Reeves drove her back to Harlow General on the morning of the 4th day. They didn't talk much in the car. He had that quality, comfortable with quiet, that she'd noticed the first night in the parking lot corridor, and she'd come to appreciate it in the days since, when everything had been noise and movement, and the particular exhaustion of high-stakes situations that don't resolve cleanly but gradually, like a weather system moving through. He pulled up at the staff entrance, left the car running. "Calloway wants to keep a channel open," he said. "Not operational, just if Bray's information opens additional threads, she may need context. She'll be in touch." "That's fine." "And the Admiral, he's back on the coast next week, but Nadia is being discharged tomorrow. She wants your number." He paused. Her words were, "I have follow-up questions. I don't know what that means." "I think she wants to have coffee," Margaret said. He considered this. "That seems possible." He looked at her. "And you? What do you want?" She thought about it, which she hadn't allowed herself much time to do in the last 4 days. The rotation started Monday. She had 3 plants that needed watering. She had a bus schedule she'd been varying since the phone call on the 4th day, and would probably vary for a while yet, not out of fear, but out of the kind of caution that is just good sense when you know what you know. She had Harold Finch, who would come in for a stent procedure next week, and whose case would probably be assigned to her floor, because continuity of care is a documented clinical value, and OSE believed in documented clinical values. She had Patrice at the charge desk, who didn't carry any of Delia's institutional gravity. She had a hospital that had spent 14 months getting her wrong and was now in the position of having to reckon with what getting her wrong had cost. "To go to work," she said. Reeves looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, not dismissively, not indulgently. The nod of someone who understands that this is not a small answer. She got out of the car. The morning shift started at 6:15. She arrived at 6:05, changed in the locker room, made coffee from a fresh pot that someone on night shift had started before leaving. Decent, not burned. She stood at the break room counter and drank it and looked at the assignment board. Her name was in the senior rotation column. She wrote it there herself, because that was the process, and because she had learned a long time ago that the value of a thing is not diminished by the fact that you have to do the paperwork to claim it. The shift began. A post-op patient in Bay 6 who needed wound assessment and a conversation about medication compliance, the compliance part taking longer than the wound part, because it always did, because people are more complicated than their diagnoses, and the complication is usually the point. A family in the waiting room who needed someone to tell them, in plain language without the protective jargon, what the surgeon had actually said. An elderly woman in Bay 2 who had been brought in by a neighbor, and who had no documented next of kin, and who looked at Margaret with the particular look of someone who expects to be processed rather than seen. Margaret sat with her for 7 minutes, which was 4 minutes more than the triage allocation. She asked about the neighbor. She asked about the apartment and how long the woman had lived there, and whether the window faced east or west, because people who are lonely talk about their windows and their views and the times of day they most prefer, and the talking matters. And the 7 minutes were not wasted. She moved through the morning. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Around 9, she was in the medication room when she heard the automatic doors at the main trauma entrance cycle open. She heard the radio traffic from the paramedics, the spike of voices from the primary bay, the particular pitch of an incoming that required everything to move at once. She closed the medication cabinet, picked up her clipboard, and she walked toward the sound. Not because she was called, not because it was assigned, because the work was there and she knew how to do it, and she had stopped somewhere in the last 4 days, apologizing for what that meant about who she was. She had been the nurse they moved to Overflow to keep her out of the way. She had been the woman with a past that nobody in the building knew, and a set of skills that showed up in moments of pressure like a language you don't forget even when you stop speaking it. She had been the person that a methodical patient operator decided was too observant to risk, and had spent 14 months in controlled distance accordingly, and had still, through the ordinary accumulation of showing up and paying attention and refusing to be less than what she was, ended up in exactly the room where it mattered. She had not done it perfectly. She had missed Delia for 14 months. She had been moved around a board and not seen the hand doing the moving. She had been alone in ways she'd told herself were choices, and that were also, honestly, sometimes just loneliness that she'd learned to make functional. None of that canceled the rest of it. The trauma bay doors were 15 feet away. Through the small window, she could see the controlled motion of a team around a gurney, someone incoming, vitals being called out, the organized urgency that looks like chaos from outside and is, from inside, just work. She pushed through the door. She had patience.